The wind came down from the northern peaks, not like a breeze but like a blade, seeking out every tear in a coat and every crack in a man's resolve. It was late October in the high country of Wyoming, a time when the land stripped itself of color and prepared to kill anything too weak to find shelter. The grass was already parched, bleached to the color of old bone, rattling against the legs of the jagged mesas that rose up like broken teeth against the gray sky. Elias Thorne rode with his chin tucked into his collar, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the biting grit. He was a man worn thin by the miles, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a duster that had seen better years, perhaps better decades. Under him, his horse, a grulla gelding named Smoky, walked with the plodding resignation of an animal that knew there was no grain waiting at the end of the trail, only dry hay and cold water. Elias reached a gloved hand into his vest pocket and withdrew the small leather pouch he kept there. He did not need to open it to know what was inside. He could feel the shape of them through the leather. $3 silver and a handful of copper cents. That was the sum total of 10 years of drifting, of punching cattle in Texas, breaking horses in Nevada, and digging for gold that wasn't there in the Dakotas. It was not enough to buy a winter's worth of warmth in a town boarding house. If he rode into Granite Creek tonight, he would spend half of it on a bed and a hot meal, and by next week, he would be sleeping in a livery stable, begging for odd jobs. He shoved the pouch back into his pocket. He was 34 years old, but his joints felt 50, and his soul felt older than that. He was tired of the noise of saloons and the hollow camaraderie of men who would steal your boots if you slept too soundly. He had heard talk in the last town, a whispered conversation between two freighters loading supplies. They spoke of the Holloway place, a homestead tucked away in a remote valley called Dead Man's Wash. They said the Holloway sisters were running the place alone since their father died, and that they paid fair wages because no local men would work for them. The freighters had laughed when they said it, a dark, knowing laugh that Elias had not liked, but he was in no position to be picky about reputation. He turned Smoky's head away from the main road and toward the narrow mouth of the canyon that led to the wash. The walls of the canyon rose up sheer and red, blocking out the weak afternoon sun. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. As he rode deeper, the wind changed. The sky above the canyon rim turned a bruised purple, and the air grew heavy with static. Elias knew the signs. He spurred Smoky, trying to reach the shelter of an overhang, but the storm hit with the sudden violence of an ambush. It was a dust storm, a blinding wall of red earth picked up from the dry plains and hurled through the canyon like buckshot. The world disappeared in a brown haze. Grit filled Elias's mouth and coated his eyes. Smoky shied violently, his back hoof slipping on a patch of loose shale. "Easy now," Elias shouted, though the wind snatched the words away before they could leave his lips. The horse scrambled, hooves striking sparks against the stone. Elias lost his stirrup, his body thrown hard to the left. For a heartbeat, he hung over the edge of a drop-off, staring down into the dry creek bed 20 feet below, his fingers locked into the horse's mane, leather gloves straining. With a grunt of effort that tore at his ribs, he hauled himself back into the saddle, clamping his legs tight against the animal's heaving sides. He tasted blood where he had bitten his tongue. The dust swirled around them, a suffocating blanket, but Elias kept the horse moving, trusting the animal's footing more than his own eyes. The raw hostility of the land was palpable, a living thing that resented his presence. This was not a place that welcomed strangers. It was a place that tested them to see if they would break. They rode for another hour through the choking haze until the canyon finally widened. The wind lost some of its fury, blocked by the surrounding hills, and the dust began to settle on the sagebrush like red snow. Through the clearing air, Elias saw a thin ribbon of smoke rising straight up, gray against the darkening cliffs. He followed it, guiding Smoky up a rise until the homestead came into view. It was a stark, lonely place, but it was built with a care that surprised him. The main cabin was large, constructed of hewn logs chinked tight against the weather, with a wide porch sweeping around the front. To the left stood a sturdy barn, its roof pitched steep to shed the snow. A small corral held 2 milk cows and a sturdy plow horse, and beyond that, thin fields clung to the rocky soil. The corn stalks already harvested and stacked. It looked like a fortress against the wilderness, self-contained and silent. Elias rode into the yard slowly, keeping his hands visible on the horn of his saddle. In this country, riding up unannounced was a good way to get shot, and riding up unannounced on 3 women living alone was a good way to get shot twice. The door to the cabin opened before he had even brought Smokey to a halt. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She moved with a fluid, deliberate grace, stopping at the top step. She held a lever-action rifle in her hands, not pointed at him, but held across her chest in a way that suggested she could bring it to bear in the blink of an eye. She was tall and severe, wearing a dark work dress made of wool, her hair pulled back in a tight knot that pulled at the skin of her face. She was not old, perhaps nearing 30, but her eyes were ancient. They were the color of slate, cold and assessing. She looked at him not with fear, but with the weary calculation of a general surveying a battlefield. This was the eldest. Behind her, the door opened again. 2 more figures appeared, stepping out into the cold as if drawn by the tension in the yard. To the left of the eldest stood a woman who made Elias's breath catch in his throat, just for a second. She stood slightly apart from her sister, her arms crossed over her chest as if holding herself together. She was younger than the woman with the rifle, perhaps mid-20s. Her hair was lighter, the color of dried wheat, and loose strands escaped her braid to frame a face that was striking in its intensity. But it was her eyes that held him. They were dark and guarded, watching him with a mixture of suspicion and a deep, simmering anger. A faint, pale line of a scar ran from her temple back into her hairline, a mark of past violence that marred her otherwise smooth skin. This was the middle sister. On the other side stood the youngest. She could not have been more than 20. She wiped her hands on a soiled apron, her fingers stained dark with earth, likely from rooting vegetables in the cellar. Unlike her sisters, her expression was open. She looked at Elias with unabashed curiosity. Her head tilted to the side, a small, tentative smile flickered on her lips before she caught herself and smoothed her face into a more serious expression. Elias touched the brim of his hat, keeping his movement slow. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice raspy from the dust. The eldest sister did not lower the rifle. "State your business," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying no invitation. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said. "I am riding through from the north. I heard in the last town that you folks might be looking for a hand to help with the winter work." The eldest sister's eyes flicked over him, taking in the worn duster, the tired horse, the gun belt that hung low on his hip but looked like it hadn't been drawn in anger in a long time. "We do our own work," she said. Elias nodded, respecting the lie. He looked at the barn, then back at her. "I can see that. Ma'am, the place looks tight, but winter is coming on hard. I know cattle and I know horses. I can mend fence, chop wood, and I do not mind the cold." The middle sister spoke then, her voice lower than her sister's, husky and rich. "Why are you not working for the big outfits down in the basin? A man with your experience should not be knocking on cabin doors in the wash." Elias looked at her. He felt exposed under her gaze, as if she could see the empty coins in his pocket and the hollowness in his chest. He decided then that the only currency worth anything here was the truth. "I have worked for the big outfits," he said. "It did not suit me." The eldest sister stepped down one stair. The rifle barrel lowered an inch, but her grip on the stock tightened. "Where did you work last?" she asked. "The Bar T, over near Laramie." Elias answered. "Why did you leave?" "I was asked to leave." "By whom?" "The foreman." "Did you steal?" she asked, the question cracking like a whip. "No." "Ma'am, did you drink on the job?" "No." "Ma'am, then why were you let go?" Elias shifted in his saddle. The wind was picking up again, tugging at the sister's skirts. He looked at the middle sister, then back to the eldest. "The foreman had a dog," he said quietly. "A good animal. It got underfoot one day in the corral. The foreman took a length of chain to it when a young boy, a stable hand, tried to stop him. The foreman turned the chain on the boy. "And?" the youngest sister asked, her voice small. "And I stepped in," Elias said. "I hit the foreman. I hit him hard enough that he did not get up for a while. When he did, he told me to ride. He sent word to the other ranches in the valley that I was a troublemaker. So I rode north." Silence stretched across the yard. The wind howled around the corner of the cabin, rattling the shutters. The eldest sister studied his face, looking for the lie, looking for the braggart. She found neither. "Do you drink, Mr. Thorne?" she asked again. "I take a whiskey now and then," Elias admitted, "but never when there is work to be done, and never until I fall down. Are you running from the law?" "No, ma'am, the law and I have no quarrel." She looked at her sisters. The youngest nodded vigorously, her eyes pleading. The middle sister, the one with the scar, looked at Elias for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The eldest turned back to him. "You can put your horse in the barn. There is an empty stall. You will sleep in the bunkhouse. It is dry, but there is no stove, so you will have to rely on your blankets. We will pay you $20 a month and board. It is a trial. 1 month. If you are lazy, or if you drink, or if you offer any disrespect to anyone in this family, you will be gone before your boots hit the ground. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elias said. "Dawn until dark," she added. "We do not keep banker's hours here." "I am no banker," Elias said. He dismounted, his knees cracking as his feet hit the frozen earth. He led Smokey toward the barn, feeling the eyes of the 3 women on his back like a physical weight. Supper was a quiet affair. They allowed him to eat at the main table in the cabin, which surprised him. Most ranches would have made him take a plate to the bunkhouse. The cabin was warm, heated by a massive stone hearth. The furniture was simple, made of pine, but polished to a shine. Elias sat at the end of the table. The food was simple: venison stew, cornbread, and strong coffee, but it was hot and filling. As he ate, he could not help but notice the absence of men. There was no pipe rack on the mantel, no muddy boots by the door larger than a woman's size, no heavy coat hanging on the peg. The sisters managed everything. He could see it in their hands, calloused and strong. He could see it in the way they passed the bread and poured the coffee, with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. But the air in the room felt brittle. It was a strong house, built on rock, but it felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for a blow it knew was coming. The youngest sister, whose name he learned was Abigail, tried to make conversation. "You said you came from Laramie," she said. "Did you see the new railroad depot?" "I did," Elias said. "It is a big building. Brick. I would like to see a brick building one day," Abigail said wistfully. "Hush, Abby, the eldest," Martha said gently. "Eat your stew." Elias looked up. "I heard about this place back in Granite Creek," he said, trying to be polite. "A couple of freighters mentioned the Holloway homestead, said it was the best land in the wash." The reaction was immediate and sharp. Martha's spoon clattered against her bowl. Abigail looked down at her lap, her ears turning pink. But it was the middle sister, Clara, who reacted most strongly. She had been tearing a piece of bread, and her hands froze. She looked up at Elias, and her eyes were hard as flint. "What else did they say?" she asked. Her voice was low, dangerous. Elias paused, sensing he had stepped onto treacherous ground. "They said you paid fair wages," he said carefully, "and that you kept to yourselves." Clara stared at him, searching his face for the mockery he knew existed in town. When she saw only his weary honesty, the tension in her shoulders dropped slightly, but the hardness did not leave her eyes. "We keep to ourselves because we have to," Clara said. "We do not discuss town gossip at this table," Martha cut in, her tone final. The rest of the meal passed in silence, the only sound the scraping of spoons and the crackle of the fire. Elias finished his coffee quickly, thanked them for the meal, and excused himself. The bunkhouse was a small structure set 20 yards from the main cabin. It was little more than a shed, with 4 wooden bunks built into the walls. It was cold inside, the air smelling of old straw and dust. Elias unrolled his bedroll on the bottom bunk, keeping his coat on. He lay in the dark, listening to the wind scrape against the rough boards. The wind here sounded different than it did on the open plains. It sounded like voices, muttering and arguing in the dark. He felt a strange mixture of sensations in his chest. On one hand, he was safe. He had a roof, a job, and food for the next month. He would not freeze on the trail. But on the other hand, there was a deep unease in this valley. The Holloway sisters were hiding from something, or fighting something, and he had walked right into the middle of it. He could not sleep. He got up and walked to the single small window, wiping the frost away with his sleeve. Across the yard, the main cabin was dark, save for a single light moving on the porch. He watched as the door opened and Clara stepped out. She was holding a lantern, the yellow light casting long, dancing shadows against the logs. She wore a heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders, but her head was bare. She walked to the edge of the porch and stood there, looking out into the darkness, toward the canyon entrance where he had come in. She stood with her shoulders squared, her back straight. She looked like a sentry standing guard over a fortress under siege. Elias watched her, transfixed. He saw the way the wind caught the loose strands of her hair, the way the lantern light illuminated the sharp line of her jaw and the curve of her cheek. He felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. Curiosity. Yes, but also something warmer, something he had not felt in years. He felt a desire to step out that door and stand between her and whatever darkness she was watching for. He forced himself to turn away from the window. He was a hired hand. Nothing more. He was here to fix fences and feed cattle, not to rescue women who looked like they could shoot the wings off a fly at 100 yards. He lay back down on the hard bunk and pulled his hat over his eyes. But the image of Clara standing in the lantern light burned in his mind until sleep finally took him. The next day, the valley showed its teeth. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and the ground was hard as iron. Elias was up before the sun. He broke the ice in the horse trough with the heel of his boot, the sound cracking loud in the silent morning. He fed the horses, pitched hay for the cows, and started on the woodpile. By the time the sun crested the mesa, he had split a cord of wood. His hands, though calloused, stung from the vibration of the axe, and his breath smoked in the frigid air. The sisters did not stay inside. Martha came out first, carrying 2 heavy buckets of milk from the barn. She walked past him with a nod, her face set against the cold. Abigail went to the chicken coop, cooing to the hens as she gathered eggs. Clara came out last. She was dressed in a man's heavy coat that was too big for her, cinched at the waist with a belt. She wore leather gloves and carried a coil of wire and a pair of fencing pliers. She walked over to where Elias was stacking wood. "The north fence is down," she said, not wasting time with greetings. "The wind took out 3 posts last night. If we do not fix it, the cattle will wander into the canyon. I will get my horse," Elias said, driving the axe into the chopping block. "I am coming with you," she said. Elias looked at her. "It is rough work, Miss Holloway. I can handle it. I know it is rough work," she said, her eyes narrowing. "That is why I am coming. You do not know the line yet, and I do not let men work my land alone until I know they can be trusted not to cut corners." Elias did not argue. He saddled Smokey, and Clara saddled a roan mare that looked as spirited as she was. They rode out together toward the north ridge. The work was brutal. The ground was frozen too hard to dig new post holes, so they had to build rock cribs to hold the posts upright. They hauled heavy stones from the base of the ridge, their breath mingling in the air. The wire was stiff with cold, fighting them every inch of the way. Elias watched Clara work. She did not complain. She lifted stones that would have made a town man groan. She twisted the heavy gauge wire with a strength that surprised him. She worked with a fierce, driven intensity, as if every fence post was a personal victory against the world. They worked side by side for hours. At one point, Elias slipped on a patch of ice while carrying a heavy rock. He went down on one knee. Clara was there in an instant, her hand gripping his arm to steady him. "Careful," she said. "A broken leg out here is a death sentence." Her grip was strong. For a moment, they were close, less than a foot apart. He could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, and the faint white line of the scar at her temple. He could smell the scent of sage and cold air on her skin. "I am fine," he said, his voice rough. She held his arm for a second longer than necessary, then released him and stepped back, wiping her hands on her coat. "We have 2 more posts to set," she said, turning away. By the time they rode back to the homestead, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. Elias was exhausted, his muscles aching, his hands raw, but he felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in a long time. The fence would hold. He put the horses away and walked toward the bunkhouse. Martha was waiting for him on the porch of the main cabin. She was wrapped in a shawl, her face obscured by the shadows. "Mr. Thorne," she called out softly. Elias stopped and turned. "Yes, ma'am, you worked well today." She said, "I aim to earn my keep," he replied. Martha stepped down into the yard. She walked until she was only a few paces from him. Her voice dropped, becoming low and intense. "We appreciate the work," she said, "but you need to understand something. We live this way because we choose to. We have our own rules in this valley. We answer to no one but ourselves and the Almighty." "I respect that," Elias said. "Do you?" she asked. "Men often say they respect independence until they realize it means they are not in charge. If you cannot respect our way, if you try to change things, or if you think 3 women alone are in need of a savior, you should ride on while you still can. We do not need saving, Mr. Thorne. We need fences mended." Elias looked at her, seeing the steel behind the words. He understood that she was warning him not just about the work, but about them, about her sisters, about the walls they had built that were far stronger than the logs of the cabin. "I am just here to work, Miss Halloway," Elias said. "I have no desire to change anyone." Martha studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good night, Mr. Thorne." "Good night, ma'am." She turned and went back inside. As the door opened, Elias saw Clara standing by the hearth, warming her hands. She looked up as the door opened, and her gaze shot past Martha, straight to Elias standing in the dark yard. Her eyes met his, and for a split second, the guard dropped. There was no anger, no suspicion, just a raw, unguarded recognition. A look that said she saw him, really saw him, and that she was terrified of what that meant. Then she looked away. The door closed, and the latch clicked into place, leaving Elias alone in the cold, with the wind whispering secrets he was not yet allowed to hear. Winter fell upon the valley not with a whimper, but with the heavy, suffocating silence of a shroud. The sky turned the color of bruised iron and stayed that way for weeks. The ground, which had been hard before, now became like granite, ringing under the strike of a hoof or the bite of a pick. Elias Thorne learned quickly that survival in Dead Man's Wash was not a matter of luck, but of relentless, grinding motion. If you stopped moving, the cold found your bones. If you stopped working, the ranch died. He spent his days in a haze of physical exertion that left him too tired to dream. He chopped wood until his palms were a map of blisters, popping and callousing over in a cycle that left his skin tough as rawhide. He rode the fence lines in winds that cut through his duster like knives, his fingers stiff and clumsy as he twisted wire with pliers that felt like burning ice against his skin. One afternoon, a heifer went down in the frozen mud near the creek, laboring to birth a calf that was twisted wrong inside her. Elias stripped off his coat, rolling his sleeves up his shivering arms, and knelt in the muck. The wind screamed around them, carrying spindrift from the drifts along the bank. He worked for an hour, his hands slick and freezing, fighting the contraction of the cow's muscles, soothing her with low murmurs that were snatched away by the gale. When he finally pulled the calf free, a steaming wet bundle of black and white, he felt a presence beside him. It was Clara. She had come out with blankets, not waiting for him to ask. Together, they rubbed the calf dry with rough burlap sacks, their shoulders bumping, their breath pluming together in the gray air. She did not say a word, but when they stood up, covered in mud and blood, she looked at him with a nod that meant more than any praise from a foreman he had ever known. It was in these weeks that the small kindnesses began to appear, like green shoots pushing through snow. Elias would come into the kitchen in the morning, his eyes gritty with sleep, to find his mug already sitting at his place, steaming hot. It was always full to the brim, black and strong, just the way he took it. He never saw who poured it, but once he caught Clara retreating to the pantry as he entered, a faint flush on her neck. He drank it slowly, letting the heat seep into his chest, feeling a gratitude he did not know how to voice. In return, he watched. He noticed the latch on the small, glass-paned greenhouse attached to the south side of the cabin was broken. It was Abigail's sanctuary, where she coaxed winter herbs and a few stubborn geraniums to life. The wind rattled the door constantly, letting in drafts that threatened her plants. One evening, while the sisters were washing up after supper, Elias took a piece of scrap iron and a file to the workbench in the barn. He shaped a new latch, filing the edges smooth, and oiled the mechanism until it slid silent as a shadow. He installed it the next morning while Abigail was milking the cow. When she found it later, he heard her exclaim from the yard. She found him by the woodpile, her face glowing. "You fixed it," she said, her breath puffing in the air. "The door, it stays shut now." "Draft was bad for the herbs," Elias said, not looking up from his axe work. "Thank you, Elias," she said softly. He nodded, swinging the axe. It was just a latch. But when he looked up later, he saw her watching him from the window. And for the first time, her smile did not flicker and die. It stayed. Yet, despite these moments, the tension in the house never fully broke. It was a coiled thing, living in the corners of the room. The sisters rarely laughed. If a board creaked in the night, 3 heads would snap up, eyes wide and alert. If a rider appeared on the distant ridge, even just a traveler passing through, work would stop, and Martha would reach for the rifle she kept by the door. They lived with their eyes on the horizon, expecting a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Elias felt like he was walking through a room filled with invisible tripwires. He moved carefully, spoke softly, and kept his questions to himself. One evening, the wind died down, leaving a silence that felt unnaturally loud. Elias finished his chores in the bunkhouse and realized he had left his whetstone in the barn. He walked across the frozen yard, his boots making no sound on the packed snow. The barn door was cracked open a few inches, spilling a slice of lantern light onto the snow. As he reached for the handle, voices stopped him. They were low, fierce whispers, sharp with an argument that had clearly been going on for some time. "He cannot stay past the winter," Clara's voice hissed. "It is dangerous, for him and for us. He is a good man." "Clara," Abigail's voice pleaded, softer, trembling. "He fixed the greenhouse. He saved the calf. He is not like the others. They are all like the others in the end." Martha's voice cut in, steady and hard. "When they find out, when the town gets to them, we cannot run this place alone forever," Abigail said. "The law? Do not speak of the law like it is a solution," Clara snapped. "The law is a burden, and if we let a man in again, if we let Elias in, we have to be sure. We have to be absolutely sure." "He looks at you." "Clara," Abigail whispered. "I have seen it." Clara's silence was heavy. Then her voice came again, strained. "That is what I'm afraid of. Desire is easy. The rest of it, the judgment, that is what breaks them. And I will not survive another man looking at us with that specific kind of hate." Elias stood frozen. His hand hovered over the wood of the door. The judgment, the law. The words spun in his head. Then his boots shifted, crunching a piece of ice. Inside, the silence was instant. "Is someone there?" Martha called out, her voice pitching up, sharp as a cracked whip. Elias stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited a beat, then scuffed his boots loudly against the threshold and pushed the door open, whistling a tuneless note as if he had just arrived. He walked into the circle of lantern light. The three sisters were standing near the grain bins. Martha's hand was near the pitchfork leaning against the wall. Clara's face was pale, her eyes wide and dark. Abigail looked like she might cry. "Forgot my whetstone," Elias said, keeping his voice even, though his throat felt tight. Dull knife is dangerous work. He walked past them to the workbench, found the stone, and pocketed it. He could feel their eyes boring into his back. The air in the barn was thick enough to choke on. "Good night, ladies," he said, touching the brim of his hat. He walked out without looking back, but he could feel the weight of their gaze until the bunkhouse door closed behind him. 2 weeks later, the supplies ran low. Flour, sugar, and coffee were nearly gone. It was decided that Abigail would take the wagon into Granite Creek and that Elias would drive her. The roads were treacherous, and Martha refused to let the youngest go alone. The drive was long and cold. Abigail sat beside him on the buckboard, wrapped in 3 blankets, her nose red from the chill. She tried to make small talk about the landscape, pointing out hawk nests and deer tracks, but Elias was distracted. He was thinking about the barn, about the fear in Clara's voice. When they rolled into Granite Creek, the town looked grim under the gray sky. Smoke hung low over the rooftops. Elias tied the team in front of the mercantile and helped Abigail down. As they walked onto the boardwalk, he felt the shift. It was subtle at first, heads turning, conversations pausing, but then it grew blatant. 2 men leaning against the post of the saloon stopped talking as they approached. One of them, a thick-necked man with a stained beard, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the snow just inches from Abigail's hem. "Morning, Miss Halloway," the man said, grinning. His eyes did not look at her face. They raked over her body with a slow, insolent familiarity. "Bringing the new stud to town?" Abigail flinched as if she had been slapped. She gripped Elias's arm, her fingers digging into his coat. "Just keep walking. Elias," she whispered. "Please." Elias stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked at the man. "You got something to say, friend?" The man laughed, nudging his companion. "Not to you, Cowboy. Just admiring the merchandise. Though everyone knows you do not buy the cow when the milk is free to the whole county." Elias took a step toward him, his blood heating instantly. Abigail pulled him back with surprising strength. "No, Elias. No, we are here for flour. That is all." She dragged him toward the store. Inside, it was no better. The shopkeeper, a balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles, served them in stony silence. When Abigail placed the coins on the counter, he picked them up as if they were contagious and dropped them into the drawer without counting them back. A woman was browsing the fabric bolts nearby, a small child clinging to her skirts. When the child wandered a step toward Abigail, the woman snatched the boy back with a violent jerk. "Come away!" "Billy," the woman hissed, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Do not go near her." "You do not want to catch what they have." Elias slammed his hand down on the counter. The sound was like a gunshot. The shopkeeper jumped. "Is there a problem here?" Elias asked, his voice low and shaking with fury. "Because where I come from, a lady is treated with respect." The woman turned on him, her face twisted with righteous disgust. "Lady? You call a Halloway a lady? You are new here, mister, or you're just as sick as they are. Everyone knows what goes on in that valley. Everyone knows about their unholy father and his cult." She looked at Abigail, her eyes narrowing. "And everyone knows their sacred law. Tell me, Cowboy, have you satisfied all 3 of them yet? Or are they making you wait your turn?" The words hung in the air, ugly and grotesque. Satisfy all 3. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Abigail. She was staring at the floor, her face burning a bright, painful crimson. She was not angry. She was humiliated. A deep, weary shame that looked like it had been worn for years. "We are leaving," Elias said. He grabbed the sack of flour and the coffee, took Abigail's arm, and steered her out of the store. As they passed the men outside, someone hissed, "Holloway whore," under their breath. Elias shoved Abigail up onto the wagon seat and untied the horses with trembling hands. He wanted to hit someone. He wanted to burn the town down. But he saw Abigail's face, tear-streaked and terrified, and he knew violence would only make it worse for her. He drove the wagon out of town at a trot, not slowing down until the buildings were swallowed by the hills. The ride home was agonizingly quiet. The only sound was the creak of the wheels and the snort of the horses. Finally, Abigail spoke. Her voice was small, muffled by her scarf. "I am sorry. Elias, you have nothing to be sorry for," Elias said fiercely. "Those people they are not fit to wipe your boots. They believe it," she said. "They believe we are monsters. Because of Father. Because he preached that love was not about ownership. Because he let us learn to read and shoot and think. They called it a cult. And when he died..." She trailed off, wiping her eyes. "And this law?" Elias asked, the words tasting like ash. "What is it?" Abigail looked at him, her eyes wide and wet. "It is not what they think. It is not dirty. It was supposed to be protection. A promise that no man could come in and divide us. That if you want one of us, you have to accept all of us. You have to be family to all of us. But they twisted it. They made it sound like a harem." She shivered. "It is just words, Elias. But words can cut deeper than a knife." She refused to say more. That night, the cabin was quiet. Martha sat by the fire, mending a shirt. Clara was polishing the oil lamps. Elias sat at the table, staring into his coffee cup. The rage from the town was still simmering in his gut. "Does it not bother you?" Elias asked suddenly. The silence in the room shattered. Martha didn't look up. "Does what bother me? Mr. Thorne?" "The things they say," Elias said. "The way they look at you. I wanted to tear that store apart today." Martha bit the thread. "Gossip does not change the price of feed," she said flatly. "It does not stop the winter. It does not put meat on the table. We cannot afford to care what a town full of hypocrites thinks." "But it is not right," Elias insisted. Clara set the lamp down. She turned to him, and the firelight caught the sharp angles of her face. "Do you believe it?" she asked. The question was soft, but it landed hard. It was half accusation, half a desperate plea. She was looking at him with that same intensity he had seen in the barn, terrified of his answer, bracing for the blow. Elias looked at her. He thought of the blisters on her hands. He thought of the way she had helped him with the calf. He thought of the fierce, protective way they stood together. "I believe what I see," Elias said steadily. "I see 3 women working harder than any men I have ever known. I see a ranch that is still standing when it should have fallen. I see a family." He paused. "And I see a lot of small-minded people in town who are scared of anything they cannot control. I do not believe the lies." "Clara." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Then she nodded, once, and turned back to the lamp, but her hands were shaking. 3 days later, the blizzard hit. It came down from the mountains like a white wall, erasing the world in minutes. The temperature dropped so fast the cabin logs groaned and popped like gunfire. "Get the stock in!" Martha shouted over the roar of the wind. They all ran. It was a chaotic, freezing battle. The wind was strong enough to knock a person down. The snow was blinding, stinging the eyes like needles. Elias and Clara fought their way to the south pasture where the yearlings were huddled against the fence, rapidly being buried in drifts. They had to drag them, one by one, through the knee-deep snow toward the barn. "Grab the flank!" Elias yelled, his voice torn away by the storm. Clara was right there, her scarf wrapped around her face, grabbing the terrified calf. They stumbled into the barn, sliding the heavy door shut against the howling white void outside. The sudden silence of the barn was shocking. It was dark, smelling of hay and warm animal bodies. It was freezing, but out of the wind. Clara leaned against the stall door, gasping for breath, shivering violently. Her coat was caked with snow. Her eyebrows were frosted white. "Are you all right?" Elias asked, moving to her. She nodded, but her teeth were chattering. I cannot feel my fingers. Elias didn't think. He took her gloved hands in his and rubbed them briskly. Then, realizing the gloves were wet and frozen, he pulled them off. Her hands were ice cold, pale and blue at the nails. He unbuttoned his heavy coat and pulled her hands inside, pressing them against the warmth of his flannel shirt, against the heat of his chest. Clara gasped at the contact. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. They stood there in the dark barn, the storm raging outside, isolated from the rest of the world. Elias could feel her shivering subsiding. He could feel the rapid beat of her heart, or maybe it was his own. He looked down at her face. The snow was melting in her hair, turning the wheat color to dark gold. Her lips were parted, pale from the cold. The distance between them vanished. He didn't know who moved first, but suddenly they were inches apart. His hands moved from her wrists to her shoulders, pulling her closer. She leaned into him, seeking his heat, seeking him. Elias bent his head. Her breath was warm against his chin. He could smell the snow and the sage and the woman beneath it all. He wanted to kiss her more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. He wanted to promise her that he would stand between her and the town, between her and the wind, forever. "Clara?" he whispered. Her eyes fluttered closed. She tilted her head up. Their lips brushed, a ghost of a touch, electric and terrifying. Then she stiffened. She pulled back as if she had touched a hot stove. She stumbled away from him, hitting the stall door. "No," she gasped. "No, we cannot. Clara, the laws," she stammered, her voice frantic. "The promises." "You do not know. You cannot just—" She grabbed her frozen gloves from the floor and backed away, her eyes full of panic. "We have to go back to the house. Martha will worry." She turned and fled, pushing the heavy door open and disappearing into the white swirl, leaving Elias standing alone in the dark, his chest aching with a cold that had nothing to do with the winter. Later that night, the storm still raged. The cabin was warm, but the mood was heavy. Clara had gone straight to her room, claiming a headache. Abigail was asleep in the chair. Elias sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He felt raw, exposed. Martha sat opposite him. She was not working tonight. Her hands rested in her lap, still and calm. She had been watching him for a long time. "You like her?" Martha said. It was not a question. Elias looked up. He did not insult her by pretending he didn't know who she meant. "Yes, ma'am, I do." Martha nodded slowly. She leaned forward, the firelight casting deep shadows in the hollows of her face. "You are a good worker. Elias, you are honest. You defended my sister in town. I appreciate that." "But?" Elias asked. "But," Martha said, "loving a Holloway is not like loving other women. You saw what happened in town. That stain, it does not wash off. If you stand with us—" "The mud gets on you too. I do not care about the mud," Elias said. "You say that now," Martha said softly. "But winter makes men lonely, and loneliness can look a lot like love. When spring comes, when the road is open, men usually remember that life is easier without a burden." Elias leaned forward. "I am not looking for easy. Martha, I have had easy. I have had freedom. It is empty. I want to be here. With her." Martha studied him. Her gaze was penetrating, stripping away his defenses. "If you ever wish to ask for her hand, Elias Thorne, you must understand our law, not the lies they tell in town. The truth of it. Tell me," Elias said. "It is simple," she said, her voice dropping to a ritualistic cadence. "And it is impossible for most men. If you want one of us, you must satisfy all three, not with your body, but with your soul. You must be judged by each of us. You must prove that you can carry our shame without bending. You must prove that you will protect Abigail's innocence and my authority as much as you protect Clara's heart. No halfway, no shame." She paused. "If you fail one of us, you lose all of us. That is the law." Elias sat back. The words settled over him, heavy and absolute. It was a gauntlet. It was a fortress wall. But for the first time, he saw a gate. "I understand," he said quietly. Martha stood up. "We will see," she said. She walked to her room, leaving Elias alone by the dying fire. Outside, the wind howled, trying to tear the roof off, but the house held. And for the first time, Elias felt his heart taking root, driving deep into the rocky soil, preparing to weather whatever storm came next. The seed was planted. Now, it had to survive. The grip of winter did not break all at once. It loosened its hold finger by freezing finger. The relentless gray sheets of sky began to tear apart, revealing jagged patches of brilliant, hard blue. The silence of the deep snow was replaced by the dripping music of the thaw, a constant rhythm of water finding its way back to the earth. For Elias Thorne, the change in season brought a change in perception. When he had first ridden into Dead Man's Wash, the Halloway homestead had been nothing more than a shelter against the wind, a place to trade sweat for bread. But as the drifts receded to the shadows of the canyon walls, he realized the ranch had become something else entirely. He knew the groan of the third step on the porch stairs and how to step over it so as not to wake the house. He knew the smell of the kitchen before he even opened the door, coffee and scorched flour in the morning, sage and stewed meat in the evening. He knew the rhythm of the sisters' days better than he knew the lines on his own palms. He knew that Martha would be the first up to stoke the fire, that Abigail would hum while she scattered grain for the chickens, and that Clara would stand on the back step for a long minute every evening, watching the sun die behind the mesas, her face guarded and still. It felt dangerously close to home. And for a man who had spent 15 years sleeping in bedrolls and bunkhouses, the feeling was both a comfort and a terrifying trap. As the days lengthened, the work shifted from survival to maintenance. The cattle needed to be moved to higher ground where the grass was waking up. The fences, battered by the blizzards, needed extensive repair. Elias and Clara rode out together often. It was practical. The work required 2 pairs of hands, and Martha was needed at the house while Abigail tended the garden. But there was more to it than utility. There was a magnetic pull between them, a gravity that had established itself during the storm and had only grown stronger in the silence that followed. One afternoon, they were tracking a missing cow up a narrow draw known as Coyote Gulch. The mud was thick, sucking at the horse's hooves. They found the cow tangled in a patch of chokecherry brush, unhurt but bawling. As they worked to free her, cutting back the branches, the conversation drifted from the task at hand to the ghosts that haunted them both. They sat on a flat rock to rest, sharing a canteen of water. The sun was warm on their backs, a stark contrast to the biting wind of the month before. Clara took a drink and wiped her mouth with the back of her glove. She looked out over the valley, her expression softening in a way that made Elias's chest ache. "My father used to bring us up here," she said quietly. "Before the trouble started, he said this place was closer to God because there was nothing in the way, no church walls, no stained glass, just the sky." Elias watched her profile. "The town says he was a hard man," he said, testing the waters. "A fanatic." Clara laughed, but it was a dry, brittle sound. "The town says what they need to say to justify what they did. He was not a fanatic. Elias, he was a man who believed that faith should be gentle. He preached that love was a verb, not a noun. He taught us to read, to think, to question. That is what scared them. A man who teaches his daughters that they are equal to any man is a dangerous thing in a town like Granite Creek." She looked down at her hands. Mother died when Abigail was just a baby. A fever took her in 3 days. Father tried to be both parents. He tried so hard. But when the cattleman, Mr. Henderson, decided he wanted our water rights, he started the whispers. He said Father was running a cult. He said we were unnatural. She stopped, the silence around the memory thick and heavy. She did not describe the night the mob came, or how her father had died, or the specific words they had screamed. She didn't have to. The scar on her temple and the steel in her spine told the story loud enough. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It is a heavy thing, to carry the sins of other people's lies," he said. Clara looked at him. "And what do you carry, Elias? You have a way of looking at the horizon like you expect it to disappear. Elias picked up a stone and tossed it into the brush. I carry the fact that I never stayed anywhere long enough to be pinned down. He said, my father was a cold man. He drifted from job to job, dragging me and my brother with him. He taught us that putting down roots was just giving the world a place to bury you. He paused, the old guilt rising in his throat like bile. When I was 18, I left. I just saddled a horse in the middle of the night and rode out. My brother, Thomas, he was 14. He begged to come with me. He was standing there in the dark, holding his boots, crying. I told him he was too young. I told him I would come back for him when I got settled. And did you? Clara asked softly. Elias shook his head. I never got settled, and by the time I went back, 3 years later, they were gone. No one knew where. I left him with a man who thought kindness was a weakness. I have been looking for a place to stop running ever since, but I never felt like I deserved to find one. Clara reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it over his. Her touch was hesitant, but warm through the leather of his glove. You are here now. Elias, she said. The words hung between them, full of promise and danger. The moments of intimacy began to accumulate, like dry tinder waiting for a spark. A week later, Elias sliced the palm of his hand on a rusted barb of wire. It was a jagged cut, bleeding freely. He rode back to the barn, intending to wrap it in a rag and keep working. But Clara intercepted him. She marched him into the kitchen, sat him down at the table, and fetched the basin of hot water and the iodine. The house was empty. Martha and Abigail were in the root cellar. Give me your hand, she ordered, though her voice lacked its usual command. Elias extended his hand. Clara washed the grit and blood away with a cloth. The iodine stung, but Elias barely felt it. He was too focused on the curve of her neck as she bent over his hand, and the way her fingers trembled slightly as she wound the clean white bandage around his palm. She tied the knot and looked up. Their faces were inches apart. He could see the golden flecks in her dark eyes, dilating as she looked at him. You need to be more careful, she whispered. I was distracted, Elias murmured. By what? By you, he said. You were riding ahead of me. The light was on your hair. I forgot to look at the wire. Clara's breath hitched. She did not pull away. For a long moment, the air in the kitchen was charged with a static electricity that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. Then, the back door creaked, and the moment shattered. Clara pulled her hand back and stood up quickly, turning to the stove as Martha walked in. Another evening. They rode back late from the high pasture. The temperature had dropped sharply with the setting sun, and the wind had teeth again. Clara was shivering, her coat too thin for the sudden freeze. Without a word, Elias stripped off his heavy duster. He rode his horse alongside hers and draped the coat around her shoulders. Keep it, he said when she tried to protest. I am warm enough. It was a lie. The cold bit through his flannel shirt instantly. But watching Clara pull the collar up, burying her face in the worn leather and sheepskin, warmed him more than the coat ever had. He saw her inhale deeply, breathing in the scent of him, tobacco, horse, and pine, and the look she gave him across the gap between their horses was unguarded and raw. It was the accumulation of these moments that finally pushed Elias to the edge. He could no longer pretend that he was just a hand passing through. He could no longer pretend that the ache in his chest was just loneliness. It happened on a Tuesday evening, after the supper dishes had been cleared. The fire was roaring in the hearth, casting long shadows against the log walls. Martha was accounting in a ledger. Abigail was mending a sock. Clara was reading a book, though Elias had noticed she hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. Elias stood by the fireplace, his arm resting on the mantel. He watched them, this unit, this fortress of 3, and he knew he had to speak. Miss Martha, he said. His voice was loud in the quiet room. Martha looked up from her ledger, marking her place with a finger. Yes, Mr. Thorne. Elias took a breath. He looked at Clara, who had frozen, her eyes wide. Then he looked back at the eldest sister. I have been here 5 months. He said, the winter is over. By the terms of our agreement, my trial is done. I could ride out tomorrow. Abigail looked up. her face falling. "You are leaving?" "No," Elias said firmly. "That is just it. I do not want to leave." He turned his body fully toward them. "I am a man of simple words, so I will speak plainly. I have come to care for this place, and I have come to care for your sister." The silence that followed was absolute. The fire popped, a sound like a pistol shot. Clara lowered her book slowly, her face pale. "I am asking for your permission to court Clara," Elias said, openly, seriously. "I am not looking for a winter distraction. I am looking for a wife, and I am asking her. And you, if I might have the chance to prove I am worthy of that." Martha closed the ledger. The heavy thud of the book cover echoed in the room. She stood up. She was not a tall woman, but in that moment, she seemed to loom over them all. Her face was unreadable, a mask of stone carved by years of defensive vigilance. She walked around the table and stood before Elias. She looked him up and down, searching for a crack in his resolve. "You ask a great deal, Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was low, devoid of the warmth that sometimes crept in during supper. "I know," Elias said. "Do you?" Martha asked. "You know the rumors. You know what they call us in town. You know that any man who binds himself to a Holloway binds himself to our shame." "I do not care about the town," Elias said. Martha's eyes narrowed. "It is not just the town you must contend with. It is us. It is our law." She let the words hang there. "Our law." Abigail let out a small, hopeful sound, but Martha silenced her with a glance. She turned back to Elias. "Decades ago, before the lies turned everything to poison, our father established a rule for this family," she said. "He knew that 3 women alone would be prey. He knew that men would come trying to divide us, trying to pick off the weak one to get to the land, or to use us and leave us broken. So we swore a covenant." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated with intensity. "The sacred law of the Holloway sisters is this: if a man wants to marry one sister, he must satisfy the sisters first. All 3 of us." The words were provocative. Satisfy. The sisters. In the mouth of a brothel, madam. They would have meant one thing. In the mouth of Martha Holloway, standing in her high-necked wool dress with a rifle leaning by the door. They sounded terrifyingly different. Elias felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. He was aware of the darkness of their reputation, the whispers of cults and harems. He felt drawn in by the challenge and simultaneously put on trial. "I have heard the rumors," Elias said, his voice steady though his heart hammered. "But I am asking you, man to woman, what that means. In plain terms," Martha did not blink, "it means that you do not just marry a woman, Mr. Thorne. You marry a family. You marry a history. To take Clara, you must be judged by me, and you must be judged by Abigail. You must prove yourself to each of us in the way we see fit." She paced a small circle. "You asked for plain terms. Very well. Satisfaction means trust. It means you must give each of us what we require to believe you are not another wolf at the door. It might be labor that breaks your back. It might be a truth that breaks your pride. It might be standing in front of a loaded gun so we do not have to—" She stopped and faced him. "It will not be easy. It might be humiliating. We will strip you down to your core, Elias Thorne, to see if there is rot in the wood. If you fail one of us, you fail all of us. You will pack your roll and ride, and you will never look back." Elias looked at Clara. She looked terrified. Her hands were gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at him as if she were begging him to run, to save himself, and yet, deep in her eyes, there was a desperate, flickering hope that he would stay. Abigail was smiling, a wobbly, teary smile. She wanted him to pass. She wanted to believe that a man could be good. Elias looked back at Martha. He felt a surge of stubborn pride. He had survived the winter. He had survived the dust and the hunger. He would not be scared off by a test of character. And more than that, he looked at Clara, at the woman who had bandaged his hand, who had ridden into the storm with him, and he knew he could not walk away. "I agree to your law," Elias said. Martha held his gaze for a long 10 seconds. Then she nodded once. "Very well," she said. "The first judgment is mine. Get some sleep, Mr. Thorne. You will need it." The first test began while the stars were still sharp and cold in the black sky. Elias was pulled from sleep by the harsh rapping of a knuckles on the bunkhouse door. He opened it to find Martha standing there, holding a lantern and a shovel. "Get dressed," she said. It was 4 in the morning. The air was frigid. Elias dressed quickly and met her in the yard. "The old well line has been dry for years," Martha said, pointing to a depression in the earth near the canyon wall. "We need water for the south field if we are to expand the planting this year. You will dig a new trench, 4 feet deep, from the spring head to the trough." The ground was rocky, a mixture of frozen clay and granite shale. It was work for a mule team, not a single man. But Elias took the shovel. He dug as the sun came up. He dug as the sun climbed high and beat down on his neck. He dug until his hands, already scarred, bled into the leather of his gloves. Martha did not leave him to work alone. She did not help, but she stayed. She sat on a flat rock nearby, cleaning tack, mending harness, always watching. And as he worked, the interrogation began. It was not a conversation. It was a flaying. "You said you left a girl in Abilene," Martha said, her voice cutting through the sound of the shovel hitting rock. "Why?" She wanted a settled life. Elias grunted, heaving a heavy stone out of the trench. "I could not give it to her. Because you could not, or because you would not." "Because I was afraid," Elias admitted, not pausing in his rhythm. "Afraid of what?" "Of failing her, of turning into my father." Martha let that hang in the air. "Have you ever struck a woman?" she asked later, as he was dragging dead wood from the canyon floor to reinforce the trench walls. "No," Elias said. "Have you ever raised your voice to one in anger?" "Yes. Why?" "Because I was drunk and she was right." Elias said, "Which woman?" "A laundress in Dodge City. She told me I was wasting my life. I shouted at her to leave me be. Did you apologize?" "The next day, but she was already gone." Martha probed every wound, every scar, every shameful memory he had buried in the bottom of a whiskey bottle or left on a dusty trail. She asked about the fights he had picked. She asked about the times he had run away when things got hard. She asked about his brother. "Why did you not go back sooner?" she asked, her voice sharp. "For your brother." Elias stopped. He was waist deep in the trench. His chest was heaving. Sweat dripped from his nose. "I told myself I needed money," he said, his voice raspy. "I told myself I needed to build something first. But the truth was, I was enjoying the freedom. I put my own want ahead of his need, and by the time I remembered my duty, it was too late." He looked up at her, meeting her gaze. "I failed him. I know that. I live with that every day." Martha stared at him. She saw the raw honesty in his face. She saw that he did not try to make himself a hero. He did not offer excuses. He just offered the truth, ugly as it was. She stood up. "That is enough for today," she said. It was past sunset. Elias climbed out of the trench, his body trembling with exhaustion. Every muscle screamed. He could barely straighten his fingers. That night, Elias sat on the porch of the main cabin. He was too tired to eat. He simply sat on the bench, staring out at the darkness. The door opened softly, and Clara stepped out. She held a plate of bread and meat. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The heat radiating from her was the only thing that kept the chill at bay. "You should eat," she said softly. Elias took the plate. His hand shook as he lifted the bread. "I will," he said. They sat in silence for a long time. The moon was rising, casting a silver light over the yard, illuminating the raw scar of the trench he had dug. Clara looked at the trench, then at him. "You can still walk away, Elias," she whispered. He stopped chewing. He looked at her. Her face was in profile, beautiful and sad. "Martha is hard," Clara said. "She has to be, but she will not stop. And Abigail will want you to fight the world for her. And I..." She turned to him, and her voice cracked, a fissure running through her composure. "I am damaged. Elias, you know I am. The town, the past. It is a heavy weight. You do not owe us this. You can ride out. My heart will heal. It has healed before." She was giving him an out. She was offering him his freedom, the very thing he had chased for 15 years. Elias set the plate down on the bench. He turned and took her hands in his. They were rough, battered hands, but he held them as if they were made of glass. "I do not want to walk away. Clara," he said. His voice was rough with fatigue, but steady as stone. "I have spent my whole life walking away. I have ridden away from women, from family, from trouble. And all it got me was a lot of miles and a lot of empty nights sleeping with a gun under my saddle." He squeezed her hands. "I am tired of drifting. I am tired of belonging to nowhere and no one. I want something that is mine. I want to stand here, on this porch, and know that I am not just passing through." He leaned closer, his eyes searching hers. "I want you, Clara. Not just for a winter, for all the winters. And if that means digging ditches and answering hard questions to prove I am not going to run, then I will dig until the shovel breaks." Clara let out a soft, shuddering breath. A tear slipped down her cheek, silver in the moonlight. She did not pull away. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder, a gesture of surrender and trust. "Okay," she whispered into his coat. "Okay." Inside the darkened cabin, Martha stood by the window. She watched them, the cowboy with the honest eyes and the sister she had sworn to protect with her life. Her hand rested on the sill, tight and white-knuckled. She felt a flicker of hope, warm and dangerous, rising in her chest. He had passed her test. He had spoken the truth. But as she looked past them, toward the dark road that led to town, the fear returned. The world outside was cruel, and it did not forgive different things. She had opened the gate, just a crack, but she knew that letting love in meant letting vulnerability in, too. And in the Wild West, vulnerability was usually fatal. She turned away from the window, but she did not pick up her rifle. Not tonight. Spring arrived in the valley not with the gentle unfurling of flowers, but with the violence of a breaking fever. The snow, which had held the land in a silent chokehold for months, surrendered all at once. The sun turned fierce, striking the white slopes until they bled water. The creek, usually a polite trickle winding through the willows, swelled into a brown, roaring beast that chewed at the banks and swallowed the low-lying brush. Elias Thorne learned that mud was a more relentless enemy than snow. It was a thick, clay-heavy gumbo that clung to boots in 5-pound clumps, sucking at the legs of the horses and threatening to pull the shoes right off their hooves. The Holloway sisters did not wait for the ground to dry. They fought the land with shovels and sandbags. The river threatened the south fencing, the very barrier that kept their small herd from wandering into the treacherous labyrinth of the canyons. For 3 days, they worked in the deluge. Elias stood thigh-deep in the freezing, rushing water, driving stakes into the mud to hold back the brush dams they were building. Martha worked beside him, her skirts tied up around her waist, her face smeared with river silt, passing him heavy stones. Clara and Abigail ferried wheelbarrows of earth from the higher ground, slipping and sliding on the treacherous slope. They were a single organism, moving with a desperate, synchronized rhythm. There was no time for modesty or conversation. There was only the roar of the water and the burning ache in their shoulders. When the crest finally passed and the water began to recede, leaving behind a field of debris and a ruined fence line, they collapsed on the high bank, breathing in the smell of wet sage and exhaustion. Elias looked at the women. They were bruised, wet, and trembling with fatigue, but they had not yielded an inch of their land that they did not have to. He felt a fierce pride swell in his chest, a feeling that anchored him further to this place. He was no longer working for wages, he was working for them. But as the mud dried and the wildflowers began to push through the scarred earth, a different kind of test began. It was Abigail who approached him a week later. The youngest sister found him mending a bridle in the tack room. She was wearing her best dress, a faded blue calico that had been starched and ironed until it was stiff. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ribbon, but her hands were twisting nervously in front of her. "Elias," she said, her voice high and tight. "We need supplies. The flour is gone, and we need seed for the garden. I will hitch the wagon. Miss Abigail, Elias said, reaching for his hat. I can make the run in 4 hours if the road is firm. No, she said. Elias paused, his hand on the latch. Ma'am, I am going with you, she said. And you are not just driving the wagon. She took a step forward, her chin lifting in a gesture that reminded him painfully of Martha, the second part of the law. Elias, you passed Martha's test of labor and truth. Now you must pass mine. Elias turned fully toward her. And what is your test, Abigail? She took a deep breath. I need you to walk with me. Not behind me carrying sacks like a servant, not waiting by the wagon like a hired hand. I want you to offer me your arm. I want you to walk down the boardwalk with me, in the middle of the day, when the street is full. I want you to look them in the eye while you stand beside me. Elias looked at her. He saw the terror behind her bravado. He knew what she was asking. She did not need him to dig a ditch. She needed him to absorb the shame that the town threw at them like stones. She needed a shield that would not crack. It will cause trouble, Elias said gently. I know, Abigail whispered. That is why I need to know if you are brave enough to handle it. It is easy to fight the winter. Elias, the wind does not call you names. Elias nodded slowly. He took his brush jacket from the peg and brushed the dust from the sleeves. He settled his hat low on his brow and checked the pistol at his hip, ensuring it was loose in the holster. Then let us go to town. Miss Abigail. Granite Creek was busy with the spring trade. Wagons loaded with timber and supplies clogged the main thoroughfare. The air smelled of wet pine, horse manure, and the stale beer drifting out from the saloons. When Elias pulled the Holloway wagon up to the hitching rail in front of the mercantile, the change in the atmosphere was immediate. It rippled outward from their arrival like a shock wave. Men paused in their conversations. A woman shaking a rug on a balcony stopped, her hands freezing on the railing. Elias jumped down and walked around to the passenger side. He did not rush. He offered his hand to Abigail, helping her down with a deliberate, courtly grace. When her boots hit the boardwalk, she hesitated. Her face was pale, her eyes darting toward the group of men loitering in front of the barber shop. Take my arm, Elias said softly. Abigail slid her hand into the crook of his elbow. Her grip was tight, her fingers digging into his muscle. Head up, Elias murmured. You are a Holloway. You own the best land in the Wash. You have nothing to apologize for. They began to walk. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the thud of their boots on the wooden planks. As they passed the general store, the whispers started. They were like the hissing of snakes in dry grass. Look at that, shameless. That is the new one, the drifter. Reckon he has had his turn yet? Elias felt Abigail tremble, but she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. He slowed his pace, forcing the town to look at them. He met every stare with a flat, hard gaze that dared them to speak louder. They reached the mercantile. Elias held the door, and they went inside to buy their seed. The transaction was cold, the clerk refusing to meet Abigail's eyes, but no one spoke out of turn. It was when they stepped back out into the sunlight that the trap sprung. 3 men were blocking the path to the wagon. Elias recognized one of them, a ranch hand from the Henderson outfit, a man named Grady with a face scarred by smallpox and a reputation for cruelty. Excuse us, Elias said, his voice even. Grady did not move. He leaned back against a post, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. He looked at Abigail, his eyes traveling up and down her body with a slow, greasy leer that made Elias's blood turn to ice. In a rush, are we? Grady drawled. I was just wondering. Darlin', how you decide the rotation out there in the valley? Do you draw straws, or does the cowboy here get to choose which sister he warms up first? The men with him laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Abigail let out a small, strangled gasp. She tried to pull Elias toward the wagon, but Elias did not move. He gently disengaged her arm from his and stepped forward. Apologize, Elias said. The street had gone quiet. People were stopping to watch, a ring of faces hungry for spectacle. They were half hoping to see the Holloway hand beaten, and half secretly cheering the novelty of someone standing up to the Henderson crew. Grady laughed again, pushing himself off the post, Or what? Saddle tramp. You going to shoot me? I said apologize to the lady, Elias repeated. His voice was not loud, but it carried a vibration that silenced the murmurs in the crowd. She is no lady, Grady sneered. She is a shared. The word never left his lips. Elias moved with the sudden, terrifying speed of a rattlesnake strike. He did not draw his gun. He stepped in and drove his right fist into Grady's mouth. There was a wet crunch of teeth on bone. Grady's head snapped back, and he staggered, spitting blood. The other two men jumped in. One swung a heavy piece of firewood at Elias's head. Elias ducked, taking the blow on his shoulder, the pain shooting down his arm like lightning. He drove a knee into the man's stomach and shoved him into the horse trough, but Grady had recovered. He roared and charged, tackling Elias into the dust of the street. They rolled in the dirt, a tangle of limbs and fury. It was not a clean fight. There was no Queensberry logic here. It was gouging, biting, and hammering. Grady was bigger, heavier, and fueled by humiliation. He landed a heavy blow to Elias's eye, snapping his head back against the hard earth. Elias tasted dust and copper. His vision swam. He heard Abigail scream his name. He surged upward, fueled by a rage that had been simmering all winter. He threw Grady off and scrambled to his feet. When Grady lunged again, Elias sidestepped and drove a hook into the man's ribs, feeling the give of bone. He followed it with a straight right that laid Grady out flat on his back, unconscious before he hit the ground. Elias stood over him, chest heaving, blood dripping from a cut over his eye onto his shirt. He turned to the third man, who was backing away with his hands up. "Pick him up," Elias rasped, "and tell your boss that the next time someone speaks a foul word to a Holloway, I will not use my fists. That is enough." The sheriff pushed through the crowd, a double-barreled shotgun crooked in his arm. He looked at the unconscious Grady, then at Elias. "You are causing a disturbance." "Thorne," the sheriff said, his voice weary. "I am finishing one," Elias said, wiping the blood from his eye. The sheriff stepped close, lowering his voice. "Look, son, you fight a man like Grady. You are fighting Henderson, and you are standing up for women who this town has already judged. That is a fast way to end up dead or jobless. Ride on while you have your teeth." Elias straightened his jacket. He looked at the crowd, the shopkeepers, the wives, the men who had whispered. "If decent folks stayed quiet this long while 3 women were tormented," Elias said, loud enough for them all to hear, "then maybe the decent folks are the problem." He turned and walked back to Abigail. She was crying silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. He offered her his arm again. His knuckles were split and bleeding, his hands shaking with adrenaline, but his grip was firm. "Let us go home, Abigail," he said. The ride back to the valley was quiet, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of something breaking and reshaping itself. Abigail drove the team. Elias sat beside her, holding a cold rag from the canteen to his swelling eye. When they reached the crest of the hill overlooking the homestead, Abigail pulled the horses to a halt. She turned to him. Her eyes were red, but her face was fierce. "No one has ever done that," she said. Her voice hitched. Father tried to reason with them. He quoted scripture. He turned the other cheek until it killed him. But no man has ever bled for us without wanting something ugly in return. I did not do it for a reward." "Abigail," Elias said. "I know." She said, "That is why you passed." She reached out and touched his bruised cheek with a gentle, sisterly hand. "You are passed in my heart, Elias Thorne, not as a suitor, but as family. You belong to us now." She paused, and a sad, knowing smile touched her lips. "And I know you belong to Clara. I see the way you look at her. You fought for me today because you are my brother, but you fought for her because you are her man." Elias could not speak. He felt a lump in his throat the size of a stone. He simply nodded. Abigail clucked to the horses, and they descended into the valley as the sun began to set. But the fight in town had echoes. In the back room of the Granite Creek Bank, 2 men sat in leather chairs, sipping expensive whiskey. One was the banker, a thin man with eyes like coins. The other was Henderson, the cattle baron who owned half the valley. Henderson's face was purple with rage. "That drifter broke my foreman's jaw," Henderson growled. "He humiliated you," the banker corrected smoothly. "And he made the Holloway girls look protected. That is dangerous. Cyrus, if the town starts to sympathize with them, if they start to think of them as victims instead of pariahs, your claim on their water rights becomes much harder to justify legally." "What do you suggest?" Henderson asked. "I cannot just shoot him. The sheriff is already skittish." "Make them leave," the banker said, swirling his drink. "Make the valley too hard to hold. A cowboy is just a hired gun. He will leave if the pressure gets high enough. And 3 women alone. They will break. They always break." The campaign began 3 days later. It started small. Elias found a section of the north fence cut. The wire snipped cleanly with cutters. 20 head of cattle had wandered into the canyons, and it took Elias and Clara 2 days of hard riding to gather them back. Then, the accidents turned darker. Elias woke one night to the smell of smoke. He ran out in his long johns to find a pile of oil-soaked rags burning against the wall of the barn. He managed to shovel dirt onto the flames before they caught the dry timber of the structure. But the message was clear. If he had slept 10 minutes longer, the winter feed and the horses would have been ash. The cattle began to spook for no reason. Elias found tracks near the water trough, shod hooves that did not belong to their horses. Someone was coming in at night, haunting the edges of the property, tightening the screws. The effect on the sisters was devastating. Martha became grim, sleeping with her rifle across her lap in the rocking chair. Abigail stopped singing in the garden. She jumped at the sound of a door slamming. But it was Clara who suffered the most. The pressure cracked the shell she had built around herself. Old terrors, buried deep, began to claw their way to the surface. She woke screaming from nightmares, the sound tearing through the thin walls of the cabin. She became jumpy, her eyes constantly darting to the windows. She withdrew from Elias, her gaze fearful and haunted. Elias began sleeping in the barn loft, watching the approaches to the house. He slept in shifts, his pistol cocked and ready on his chest. He felt like a soldier in a besieged fort, watching the morale of his troops crumble. One night, the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds. The valley was pitch black. Elias was making his rounds when he saw a pale shape near the creek. He drew his gun and moved silently through the grass. As he got closer, he realized it was not an intruder. It was Clara. She was standing barefoot on the frozen mud of the bank, wearing only her white nightdress. She was staring up at the dark hills, shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself. "Clara," Elias whispered, holstering his gun. She did not turn. She spoke to the darkness, her voice thin and brittle. "He is out there, Henderson. He is watching." Elias took off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her. She was freezing, her skin like ice. "Come inside. Clara, you will catch your death." She shook her head, fighting his attempt to lead her back. No, I cannot go back in there. It feels like a cage." She turned to him, and in the starlight, her face was a mask of anguish. "He wants the land, Elias. That is how it started with Father. The cut fences, the fires, then the lies. Henderson told the town that Father was trading our virtue for safety. He told them we were running a house of sin out here. And when Father rode out to confront him, they shot him. They said it was self-defense. They said he was a madman." She grabbed Elias's lapels, her fingers digging in. "That is why we made the law. Elias, do you understand? It was not a game. It was defiance. We stood over his grave and we swore that no man would ever take one of us without accepting all of us. We made it a sacred thing, solidarity against the shame. We wanted to say that we were people, not cattle to be traded or whores to be used." She sobbed, a dry, racking sound. "But the town, they took our defiance and they twisted it. They made our protection into a joke. They made us into the monsters." "Clara," Elias said, holding her by the arms, "you are not a monster. You are the strongest woman I have ever known." "I am not strong," she cried. I am terrified." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. "And the worst part is that I want you." The confession hung in the cold air. "I want you so much it frightens me," she whispered, the words tumbling out. "I watch you work, and I want to touch you. I lie in bed and I imagine your hands on me, body, heart, and soul. Elias, I want to be your wife." She pulled back, shame flooding her face. "But don't you see? If I give in to that, if I let myself want you like that, then I am proving them right. I am just the depraved Holloway girl they say I am. I am confirming every poison rumor." Elias felt his heart break for her. He saw the trap she was in, how the cruelty of the world had turned her own capacity for love into a source of shame. He stepped closer. He did not grab her. He did not pull her in. He stood solid as an oak, offering her shelter if she chose to take it. "Clara, listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Wanting to be loved is not a sin. Desire is not dirty. It is human. What Henderson and the town say, that is their rot, not yours." He reached up and cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her frozen cheeks. "What we choose, what happens inside the walls of our home, that is nobody's business but ours. It does not belong to the town. It does not belong to Henderson. It belongs to us. You are allowed to be happy. Clara, you are allowed to want." The air between them trembled. The wind died down, leaving a silence that was filled with the pounding of their hearts. Clara looked at him, searching for judgment and finding only a devotion that burned hotter than the fire in the barn. Slowly, agonizingly, she let go of the fear. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest. Elias wrapped his arms around her. He held her tight, lifting her slightly off the cold ground. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in. The embrace was not the start of a consummation. It was too cold, too dangerous, and the shadow of the threat was too close. But it was intense. Their bodies pressed together, hip to hip, chest to chest, shaking with a mixture of cold and adrenaline, and a hunger that had been denied for too long. It was an embrace of aching restraint. Elias felt the curve of her spine, the softness of her, the desperate way she clung to him. He wanted to carry her into the cabin and lock the door against the world. He wanted to claim her, but he knew the law was not yet fulfilled. He knew they were not safe yet. "Not yet," he whispered into her hair. "But soon, I promise you, Clara, soon." They stood there for a long time under the vast, uncaring sky, two damaged souls holding each other up against the darkness. High above them, on the ridgeline of the canyon, the silhouette of a rider broke the horizon. He sat motionless on his horse, watching the two figures in the valley below. He watched the way they held each other, the obvious bond that connected them. He struck a match to light a cigarette, the brief flare illuminating a scarred, smiling face. He had seen what he needed to see. The cowboy loved the girl, and love, as Henderson had always said, was a weakness. It was a pressure point. And now, they knew exactly where to push. The explosion of tension did not come with gunfire, but with the thunder of hooves and the rustle of paper. Elias had been gone since dawn, riding to the far side of the county to purchase grain from a supplier who didn't ask questions about the Holloway name. The ranch felt empty without him, a fact that Martha noted with a frown as she swept the porch. They came at midday, 4 riders, dust-coated and arrogant, led by Henderson's new foreman, a man named Silas who had replaced the one Elias had beaten. They did not dismount at the gate. They rode right up to the porch steps, their horses trampling the small flower bed Abigail had coaxed from the dry soil. Martha was out the door in a second, her Winchester leveled at Silas's chest. "Get off my land," she said. Her voice was flat, deadly calm. Silas laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a sheaf of papers tied with red string. "Not your land anymore. Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Henderson had the county surveyor look at the old maps. Seems there was a filing error back when your daddy squatted here. This whole wash belongs to the Double H. You are trespassing." "That is a lie," Martha said, not lowering the rifle. Abigail and Clara had come to the door. Abigail was trembling, her hand gripping the door frame so hard her knuckles were white. Clara stood just behind Martha. She was dangerously still. Her face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the men with a cold, terrifying recognition. It was the look of a woman who was seeing a nightmare walk into the daylight. "It is the law," Silas said, waving the papers. "You have got a week to clear out, pack your trunks and your petticoats. We will be back. And next time, we will bring the sheriff to make it official." He looked at Clara and winked. "Unless, of course, you want to work out a trade. I reckon we could find a use for 3 women on the Double H." Martha jacked the lever of the Winchester. The sound was loud in the quiet yard. "I will put a bullet in you before you finish that sentence," she said. Silas's smile faded. He signaled his men. "You have been warned." He spat. "1 week, then we burn you out." They wheeled their horses and galloped off, deliberately riding through the laundry Abigail had hung on the line, leaving muddy prints on the white sheets. When Elias returned 2 hours later, the yard was silent. He saw the trampled flowers. He saw the muddy sheets in the dust. He threw his reins to the ground and ran into the house. He found them in the kitchen. Abigail was crying softly at the table. Martha was cleaning her rifle, her movements jerky and stiff. Clara was standing by the window, staring out, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were freezing. "What happened?" Elias asked, his voice rough with panic. Martha told him. She spoke of the papers, the threats, the deadline. Elias felt a cold knot of shame twist in his gut. He should have been here. He had promised to protect them, and while he was haggling over grain, wolves had been at the door. That shame was instantly replaced by a white-hot fury. "We fight this," he said, slamming his hand on the table. "We go to the judge. We show him the deed. We tried that." Clara said, her voice was hollow, "Before you came, when Father died, Henderson has the money. He has the lawyers. The town believes what he says. They believe we are compromised. They think Father was a squatter and a lunatic. So we just let them take it?" Elias demanded. "We let them win because they are rich." "No," Martha said. "We stay. We force them to shoot us. That is suicide," Elias said. "Then we die on our own land," Martha shot back. "Better than dying in the street." "No!" Elias shouted. The sound startled them all. He took a breath, forcing himself to think past the anger. "We do not die, and we do not leave. We fight them with the one thing they think we do not have, proof." He looked at Clara. "You said your father was a reader, a man who wrote things down. Did he keep records, letters, anything that predates Henderson's claim?" "There is a trunk," Abigail sniffled. "Under the stairs. We haven't opened it since the funeral." "Get it," Elias said. They dragged the heavy oak trunk into the center of the room. It smelled of cedar and old sorrow. Martha opened the latch. Inside were books, sermons written in a neat, looping hand, and bundles of correspondence. They dug through it for hours. Elias read legal descriptions until his eyes burned. Martha sorted through receipts. "Here," Clara whispered. She was holding a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. Her hands were shaking violently. "These are to his brother in St. Louis," she said, "from the year we arrived. He describes the filing. He describes the survey markers. And—" She unfolded a piece of parchment. It was a draft of a sermon, unfinished. She read it aloud, her voice wavering. "Truth is not a fluctuating commodity. It does not bend to the will of the powerful. I have been threatened today by Mr. Henderson, who claims my faith is madness and my land is his. But I will stand. For my daughters, I will stand. For they are the heirs of this valley, by law and by love." Tears slipped down her cheeks. He knew. She whispered. He knew they were coming for us. Elias took the paper from her. He saw the date at the top. It was 3 days before her father had been killed. "This is it," Elias said. "This proves Henderson was threatening him over the land long before any filing error was discovered. It proves premeditation. And these letters, They reference deed numbers that predate Henderson's expansion. He looked at the women. We take this to the judge. Tomorrow. Clara looked at him. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terrible conflict. This is the third test. Elias, she said softly. The room went quiet. This fight, it will not be clean, she said. If we go to court, they will drag our names through the mud again. They will ask questions about you, about us. If we lose everything, the land, the house, our lives. She stood up and walked to him. She placed her hands on his chest, looking up into his face. I need to know, she said. If this destroys us, if we end up with nothing but the clothes on our backs, will you regret it? Will you hate me for dragging you into a war you didn't start? Elias looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, not fear of poverty, but fear of losing him. He felt his own fear, sharp and biting. He was terrified. He was afraid of seeing them hurt. He was afraid that his love for her would become a weapon Henderson could use against him. But then he imagined riding away. He imagined a life without the sound of her voice, without the strength of her presence. It looked like a desert. I am scared. Clara, he admitted, I am terrified of losing, but I would rather lose everything standing beside you than win the world and be without you. He covered her hands with his own. Walking away would be the death of me. I am staying. Clara let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. She leaned her forehead against his chest, just for a second, then pulled back, her face set with a new resolve. Then we go to town, she said. They rode into Granite Creek the next morning like a funeral procession that had decided to fight back. They took the wagon, but Elias rode Smokey alongside it. His best suit brushed clean, his hat sitting square on his head. When they parked in front of the courthouse, people stopped to stare. It was a spectacle. The Holloway sisters, who usually scurried through town like ghosts, were walking up the main steps with their heads held high, and walking between them, a living wall of defiance, was the cowboy. Elias walked on the outside, shielding them from the street. He did not glare today. He looked calm, purposeful. He was declaring to every soul in Granite Creek that he belonged with them. They found Judge Miller in his chambers. He was an old man, weary and cynical, with a face like a dried apple. He looked at the four of them with a mixture of annoyance and surprise. This is highly irregular, Miller grumbled, looking at the pile of documents Elias placed on his desk. It is justice. Judge, Elias said, we have proof that the Double H claim is fraudulent. Miller picked up the letters. He read them slowly, wiping his spectacles. He was not a corrupt man, but he was a careful one. Henderson was powerful. Crossing him meant trouble. These are compelling, Miller admitted. But Mr. Henderson has a surveyor's report. A bought report, Martha said sharply. Look at the dates. Judge, my father filed on that section 5 years before Henderson even incorporated the Double H. The door banged open. Henderson strode in, followed by a man in a slick suit carrying a briefcase, his lawyer. Henderson looked at the sisters with a sneer of contempt. I heard there was a circus in town, Henderson said. I assume you are here to beg for more time? We are here to file a counterclaim, Elias said, stepping between Henderson and the women. Henderson laughed. A claim based on what? The scribblings of a lunatic? He looked at the judge. Miller, throw this trash out. You know as well as I do that the Holloway title is void. And frankly, having these women in your office is an insult to the dignity of the court. We all know what goes on in that valley. He turned his eyes to Elias. And we know what you are doing there. Cowboy, satisfying the sisters. Is it? That is the law, right? A man has to service the whole lot of them to get a seat at the table. The lawyer snickered. The room filled with a tension so thick it felt like the air before a lightning strike. Clara flinched. Abigail looked at the floor. Elias stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, but the timbre of it dropped an octave, vibrating with a ferocity that made the lawyer take a step back. You talk about their law like it is a dirty joke, Elias said, because your mind is in the gutter. Henderson. He turned to the judge. I have lived on that ranch for 6 months. I have worked the land. I have broken bread at their table, and I have been tested by their law." He looked at the sisters, then back to the judge. "It is not a ritual of sin. Judge, it is a demand for dignity. It is a rule that says any man who wants to join that family has to accept the weight of the suffering you people put on them. He has to prove he is honest. He has to prove he will protect them. He has to prove he sees them as human beings, not the rumors you spread to steal their land." Elias pointed a finger at Henderson. "This man wants you to believe they are depraved so he can take what is theirs without a fight. But I am telling you, on my honor and on the Bible if you want it, that there are no finer women in this territory. And the only indecency in this room is standing in those polished boots." Henderson's face turned purple. "Watch your mouth. Boy." Judge Miller cleared his throat. It was a dry sound, but it cut through the noise. He looked at the letters on his desk. He looked at Elias, standing tall and unafraid. He looked at the sisters, who were watching him with desperate hope. He was a careful man, but he remembered the preacher, Holloway. He remembered a man who had spoken gently. "I will take these documents into evidence," Miller said. Henderson spluttered. "Now see here, Miller." "Silence," Miller barked, slamming his hand on the desk. "I will review the chain of title. Until I issue a ruling, the Holloway claim stands. Any attempt to evict them or interfere with their property will be treated as contempt of court. Do I make myself clear, Mr. Henderson?" Henderson stared at the judge. His eyes were slits of pure hate. He realized he had pushed too hard, too fast. "Crystal," Henderson spat. He turned on his heel and marched out. Elias let out a breath. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a reprieve. It was the first time authority hadn't spat in their faces. Outside the courthouse, the sun was blinding. They walked down the steps, feeling lightheaded. Henderson was waiting by his carriage. He was alone now, his lawyer having scurried off. He watched them approach. "Thorne." He called out, "A word." Elias stopped. "Go to the wagon," he told the sisters. He walked over to Henderson. The cattleman leaned against the carriage wheel, lighting a cigar. His anger was gone, replaced by a smooth, serpentine calculation. "You put on a good show in there," Henderson said. "You have got grit. I like that. I could use a man like you." "I have a job," Elias said. "Do you?" "You have a death sentence. Son, you think that paper protects you? Winter is coming again. Accidents happen." Henderson took a drag of the cigar. "I am offering you an out. Ride away today. Leave the witches to their fate. Come work for me. I will pay you double what they can scrape together. You will have a warm bunk, respect in town, and a future that does not involve digging graves in frozen ground." He leaned in close. "Why bleed for a lost cause? Why ruin yourself for women who are already ruined? You can have a simple, easy life." "Elias, just walk away." Elias looked at him. He felt the pull of it. The memory of cold nights, of hunger, of being an outcast. Henderson was offering him the one thing he had always wanted: safety, belonging, a place where the world didn't look at him sideways. For a heartbeat, he saw it. A clean bunkhouse, money in his pocket, no burden, no shame. Then he looked past Henderson. He saw the wagon. He saw Martha, standing straight as a rod. He saw Abigail, watching him with trust. And he saw Clara. She was looking at him, her face pale and tense. She knew what was happening. She knew he was being offered a way out. And in her eyes, he saw the acceptance of her own heartbreak. She expected him to go. She expected everyone to go. And that broke him. Elias looked back at Henderson. He looked at the expensive suit, the cigar, the arrogance of a man who thought everything could be bought. "You are right about one thing, Henderson," Elias said. His voice was loud, carrying across the dusty street to the people watching. "Ruin is catching." He stepped closer, invading Henderson's space. "But I would rather be ruined with them than safe with a snake like you." He turned his back on the cattleman. "You will regret this," Henderson shouted after him. "You will all starve." Elias didn't look back. He walked to the wagon. He climbed up and took the reins. "Let us go home," he said. The ride back was silent, but the air in the wagon was charged. When they reached the ranch, night had fallen. They unhitched the horses and went inside. Martha lit the lamps. She looked at Elias, then at Clara. "I will check the stock," Martha said. "Come, Abigail." They left the room, closing the door softly. Elias stood by the fireplace, putting more wood on the embers. He felt drained, his hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. Clara stood by the table. She had not taken off her coat. "You should have taken his offer," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Elias turned. "What? He offered you safety," Clara said. "He offered you a life. You should have taken it." "Why would I do that?" Elias asked, walking toward her. "Because I cannot bear it," Clara cried out. She turned to him, her face wet with sudden tears. "Do you not see? You have done enough. You saved the land. You stood up to the town. You passed the tests. But I cannot let you be destroyed for me. I am cursed. Elias, this family is cursed. You do not deserve to be dragged down with us." She put her hands on his chest and tried to push him away. "Go, please, while you still can. Before he burns the house down. Before they kill you like they killed Father. I love you too much to watch you bleed for me." Elias caught her wrists. He held them tight against his chest. "Stop," he said. "Stop it. I am trying to save you," she sobbed. "You cannot save me from this, Clara, because I am already bound to it," Elias said fiercely. He stared into her weeping eyes. "Do you think I stayed for the wages? Do you think I fought Henderson for the fun of it? I stayed because I cannot breathe without you." He pulled her closer, ignoring her weak struggle. "I am not a hero. Clara, I am a selfish man, and my selfishness wants you. I want to wake up in this house. I want to work this land. I want to argue with Martha and tease Abigail. I want us—" He let go of her wrists and framed her face with his hands. "I told Henderson I would rather be ruined with you. And I meant it. If the house burns, we build it again. If they come for us, we fight them together. But do not insult me by telling me to leave. I am home." Clara looked at him. She searched his face for any sign of hesitation, any sign of regret. She found only rock-solid certainty. The fight went out of her. Her knees buckled. "Oh, God," she gasped. She collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest. It was a release of years of tension, years of holding herself upright against the wind. She let go. She let him take the weight. Elias held her. He wrapped his arms around her and buried his face in her neck. He held her while she shook, while she cried out the fear and the shame. He held her until the sobbing turned to quiet, hitched breaths. Their bodies were pressed close, molding together. It was an embrace of total surrender. There was no more sacred law between them in that moment, no more tests. There was only the fierce, terrifying reality of love that had survived the fire. Martha stood on the porch, looking through the window. She saw them holding each other. She saw the way Elias's hand stroked Clara's hair, the way Clara gripped his coat as if he were the only solid thing in the world. She lowered her head. She knew the war wasn't over. Henderson was still out there. The judge's ruling was just paper. But as she watched them, she realized that the sacred law had served its purpose. It had sifted the sand and found the gold. She turned away from the window and looked out at the dark valley. "Let them be happy," she whispered to the wind. "Let them have this." She picked up her rifle and began her patrol, guarding the house where Hope had finally decided to stay. The letter arrived in the saddlebag of a passing circuit rider 3 weeks before the summer solstice. It was a thick envelope, sealed with the official wax of the county court, and it bore the name Miss Martha Halloway in the cramped, spidery hand of Judge Miller. Elias Thorne was in the corral when the rider dropped it off. He watched the man tip his hat and ride on without a word, the dust settling in the quiet yard. Elias picked up the envelope. It felt heavy, not just with paper, but with the weight of the future. He walked to the house, his boots scuffing against the hard-packed earth, and found the sisters in the kitchen. Martha took the letter. Her hands, usually steady enough to thread a needle in a gale or drop a coyote at 200 yards, trembled ever so slightly. She broke the seal, The sound of tearing paper was the only noise in the room. Abigail held her breath. Clara stood by the stove, gripping a dish rag until her knuckles turned white. Elias stood by the door, his hat in his hand, watching Martha's eyes scan the legal text. She read it once, then she read it again. She lowered the paper slowly to the table. "The deed stands," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual iron. The judge ruled that the surveyor's report from the Double H was based on incomplete data. He cited father's letters. He cited the dates. The claim of the Holloway family to this wash is upheld by the court. Abigail let out a sharp cry and threw her arms around Clara. Clara closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging as if a physical yoke had been lifted from them. "But," Martha continued, her voice hardening, "there is no jail time for Henderson." The judge ruled there was insufficient evidence of criminal intent regarding the fires or the fence cutting. He has been ordered to pay a fine of $500 for the harassment and legal fees. $500, Elias said, his voice bitter. "That is pocket change to a man like Henderson." "It is," Martha agreed, "but it is also a public reprimand." The judge made it clear. If Henderson or his men set one boot on this land again without invitation, the sheriff is authorized to arrest them on sight. It was a victory, but it was a Western victory. Imperfect, dusty, and edged with danger. They had kept their home, but the wolf was still prowling the perimeter. Henderson was out there, nursing his rage and his wounded pride. His wealth still shielded him from true justice, but his power had been checked. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the valley shifted. It was as if the homestead itself exhaled. The tension that had vibrated in the air for years, the constant expectation of disaster, began to dissipate. When they went to town for supplies, the change was subtle but palpable. The silence was still there, but the sneers were gone. A woman who had once pulled her skirts away from Abigail nodded stiffly as they passed on the boardwalk. The blacksmith, a man who had refused to shoe their horses the year before, touched the brim of his hat to Elias. It was not acceptance, not yet, but the legal ruling and the story of the cowboy who had fought for them had planted a seed of doubt in the town's certainty. The Holloway sisters were no longer easy targets. They were survivors who had the law and a man with iron fists on their side. Yet, for the sisters, this new freedom felt strange. They felt lighter, yes, but also exposed. For so long, they had lived in the dark room of their reputation, hiding behind the walls of their defiance. Now, stepping into the blinding daylight of vindication, they had to relearn how to walk without looking over their shoulders. One evening, as the twilight settled purple and gold over the mesas, Martha called them all to the big pine table in the kitchen. She placed two objects in the center of the wood: the heavy family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by their father's hands, and the land deed, its edges crisp and official. "Sit down," she said. Elias sat at the foot of the table. Clara sat across from him, her eyes dark and thoughtful. Abigail sat beside her. Martha remained standing for a moment, looking at them. Then she sat at the head. "We have won the war for the land," Martha said, "but we have to decide how we are going to live on it." "We survived because we were hard. We survived because we built a wall around this family and called it a law." She ran her hand over the Bible, the sacred law. It was a shield. We told ourselves it was to protect our virtue, to protect our inheritance. And it did. It kept the weak men away. It kept the users away. But, she continued, her voice dropping, it also became a cage. The town took our shield and turned it into a weapon against us. They made our law into a rumor of depravity, and we let them. We retreated behind it. We let the shame define us almost as much as the protection did. She looked at Elias. "You have satisfied the terms of the law as it was written. Elias Thorne, you have labored. You have spoken truth. You have protected. You have stood with us when the world spat on us." Elias nodded slowly. "I have, but the law as it stands is broken," Martha said. "It is stained by the lies of Granite Creek. If we are to move forward, if we are to be a family in the light of day, We cannot live by a code that the world thinks is a sin. She looked at Abigail. What does the law mean to you, sister? Abigail looked at the deed. It means we are safe, she said softly. But I do not want to be safe because people are afraid of our rules. I want to be safe because we are good. I think we should rewrite it, not as a ritual, not as a test that sounds like a scandal, but as a simple vow. She looked at Elias and smiled. A vow that says anyone who joins this table stands with all of us, that they share the work and the worry, that they treat us with respect. Martha turned to Clara. And you, sister? What does the law mean to you now? Clara did not answer immediately. She looked at Elias. Her gaze was intense, stripping away the months of fear and hesitation. It means I have been a coward, Clara said. Her voice was shaky, but she did not look away. I hid behind the law, she confessed. I told myself I was protecting the family. I told myself I was protecting Abigail's innocence and Martha's authority. But the truth is, I was terrified. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly. I was terrified to love fully. I thought that if I took a husband, if I let myself be happy, I would be abandoning you. I thought that loving a man would make me selfish. I thought it would prove the rumors right, that I was just waiting for a man to save me. She reached across the table and took Elias's hand. Her fingers were warm, calloused, and strong. But this man did not come to save me, she said, tears filling her eyes. He came to stand beside me. He did not ask me to be less of a Holloway. He asked to be one of us. She looked at her sisters. I love him. I love him with a depth that frightens me. And I do not want to hide that anymore. I do not want to call it a test. I want to call it a life. The room was silent. The fire popped in the hearth. Martha looked at Clara, and for the first time in years, her face softened completely. The lines of worry around her eyes smoothed out. She smiled, a sad, gentle expression that transformed her. Seeing you loved well would not hurt us. Clara, Martha said softly, it would heal us. We have all lost so much. We have buried a father. We have buried our reputation. Why should we deny each other happiness now? Martha opened the Bible. She turned to a blank page at the back, where the births and deaths were recorded. She picked up a pen and dipped it in the inkwell. Then let it be written, Martha said. The new law of this house? Not a law of suspicion, but a law of solidarity. She wrote as she spoke, the scratch of the nib loud in the room. Any man who joins this family binds himself to all of us in truth, in respect, and in shared burden. He pledges his loyalty not to a rumor, but to the heart of this home. He shall be a brother to the sisters, and a husband to the wife, and a defender of the whole. She blew on the ink to dry it. Then she looked at Elias Thorne. She said formally, Are you willing to bind yourself to this family under this new covenant? Are you willing to accept us, with all our scars and all our history, as your own? Elias stood up. He felt a tremor in his legs, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of the moment. He looked at Martha, then at Abigail, and finally at Clara. I am, he said. His voice was unsteady, thick with emotion. I bind myself to you, to all three of you as family, and to Clara. He looked down at the woman who still held his hand, to Clara as my wife, for as long as there is breath in my body. Clara stood up and moved into his arms. He held her tight, right there in the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the ghosts of the past that were finally beginning to fade. The wedding took place 3 days later. It was not a grand affair. There was no church, no organ music, no guests from town to gawk or whisper. It took place in the high meadow behind the house, a place where the wildflowers were pushing through the dry soil in a riot of blue and yellow, defying the harshness of the land. The altar was a flat granite stone. The cathedral was the open sky, a vast, domed expanse of blue that stretched from the jagged peaks of the north to the red mesas of the south. The wind, usually a biting enemy, was soft that day, rustling the grass like the silk of a bridal gown. Martha officiated. She wore her best dark dress, standing tall and solemn, holding the Bible. Abigail stood as the witness, wearing a ribbon in her hair, her face glowing with a joy that seemed to outshine the sun. Elias wore his only suit, brushed clean of dust. Clara wore a dress she and Abigail had altered from their mother's trunk, cream-colored lace that had traveled west in a covered wagon 20 years before. She looked beautiful, not with the polished vanity of a town girl, but with the fierce, striking beauty of the landscape itself. Martha opened the Bible. She did not read a standard liturgy. She read from the unfinished sermon they had found in the trunk. Love is not a possession. She read, her voice carrying over the wind. It is a stance. It is the courage to stand on a rock when the sand is shifting. It is the refusal to believe the lie that we are alone. She looked at them. Do you, Elias, take this woman to be your wife? Do you promise to share her work, her grief, and her joy? Do you promise to believe her over the world's lies? Do you promise that shame will never again dictate your choices? I do, Elias said. And do you, Clara, take this man? Do you promise to let him in? Do you promise to lay down your fear and take up his name? I do, Clara whispered. There were no rings of gold. Elias had fashioned a ring from a polished piece of silver coin, hammered round and smooth. He slid it onto her finger. It caught the light of the lowering sun. Then I pronounce you husband and wife, Martha said. When Elias kissed her, it was not the chaste peck of a nervous suitor. It was a claiming. It was full of everything they had held back for 6 months. The gratitude for the wood chopped in the freezing dawn. The hunger of the glances exchanged over the dinner table. The relief of the battle won. It was fierce and tender, and it made them both tremble. Abigail wiped tears from her face. Martha smiled, and for the first time, she looked young. The land around them, the brutal, beautiful, unforgiving West, felt for once like a witness to their joy instead of an enemy to their survival. That night, the newlyweds returned to the small cabin that sat 50 yards from the main house. It had been used for storage. But in the last 2 days, Clara and Abigail had transformed it. The air inside smelled of dried lavender and pine. The bed had been mended and piled high with extra quilts, soft and thick. A single lantern cast a warm, golden circle of light against the log walls. Through the window, the stars were visible, hanging low and bright like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Elias closed the door and latched it against the wind. The silence of the room was heavy, but it was a good weight. It was the silence of privacy. Clara stood by the bed. She looked nervous, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. The reality of the moment, the intimacy she had both craved and feared, was finally here. Elias did not rush her. He took off his coat and hung it on the peg. He walked over to her and took her hands, stopping their restless motion. You are shaking, he said gently. I am a little scared, she admitted, looking up at him. Not of you, just of this, of it being real. It is real, Elias said, and we have all the time in the world. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed her palms, right over the calluses that matched his own. He kissed the pulse at her wrist. He unbuttoned the cuffs of her sleeves, his movements slow and reverent. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing over the faint white scar at her temple. This is a sacred line, he whispered. He did not treat her like a fragile thing that would break, nor like a conquest to be taken. He treated her like a territory he had finally come home to. He took up space in her arms, and he let her take up space in his. When they finally lay together under the quilts, the lantern blown out, the darkness was not empty. It was filled with whispered reassurances. I am here. I am yours. We are allowed to want this. The physical closeness was a powerful release of all the tension that had coiled in their chests through the long winter. It was a reclaiming of their bodies from the rumors and the shame. In the dark, with the wind singing outside, they were just a man and a woman who had survived enough darkness to recognize the light when they finally held it. The next morning broke cool and bright. The air was sharp with the scent of coffee and damp earth. Elias stepped out of the small cabin. He stretched, feeling the ache in his muscles from the work that never really ended. But underneath it, there was a new sensation, a sense of rootedness. He was not drifting anymore. His boots were standing on his own ground. He walked to the main house, Martha was on the porch, churning butter. Abigail was in the garden. They looked up as he approached. "Morning, brother," Abigail called out, beaming. "Morning," Elias said. He joined them, picking up an axe to split the morning wood. It was the same chore he had done 100 times, but today it felt different. It felt like an offering, not a payment. Later that day, as the sun began its descent, Elias and Clara rode out to check the north fence. They worked side by side, their horses moving in a familiar rhythm. They tightened wire, replaced a staple, and shared a canteen. As they crested the ridge, they saw a rider in the distance. It was Henderson. He was sitting on a large bay horse, watching them from the boundary of the Double H. He did not approach. He did not wave. He simply watched, a dark silhouette against the glare. Elias felt Clara stiffen beside him. He reached out and covered her hand where it rested on the saddle horn. "Let him watch," Elias said calmly. "He knows the line." Henderson sat there for a moment longer, a reminder that safety in the West was never complete. The danger would always be there, lurking on the edges. The winter would come again. The cattle would get sick. The wind would try to tear the roof off. But then, Henderson turned his horse and rode away, disappearing into the folds of the land. Elias and Clara stayed on the ridge. They looked down at the homestead below. Smoke was rising from the chimney. The cattle were grazing in the lower pasture. The creek was glittering like a silver vein in the earth. It was a hard land. It was a brutal life, but it was theirs. Clara leaned into him, her shoulder pressing against his arm. Elias wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. They sat there in the silence, listening to the wind tug at their clothes, feeling the warmth of each other's bodies. They did not need words. In that still moment, with the land stretching endless and wild in every direction, they made a silent promise. They would keep choosing each other, through the prejudice of the town, through the danger of the cattlemen, through the harshest seasons the Wyoming sky could throw at them. They knew, with a certainty deeper than the bedrock beneath their horses' hooves, that the love they had built was strong enough to stand against the Wild West and all the ghosts of their past. Thank you for listening to this story of the Holloway sisters and the cowboy who found his home. It has been a journey through the snow, the mud, and the fire of the American West. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. Did the ending satisfy you? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of grit, survival, and love on the frontier. Share your thoughts in English in the comments below. I look forward to reading them.